Olenya Air Base sits above the Arctic Circle, in Russia's Murmansk region, close enough to the pole that in June the sun barely sets. It is one of the most remote military airfields on the planet, and for that reason, one of the most trusted. For years, Russia has parked its long-range bombers here in the open, not in hardened shelters, not underground. Rows of Tu-95 Bear bombers sitting on open tarmac, wingtip to wingtip, because nobody believed anything could reach them. Not a missile, not a plane, certainly not a drone. That belief is about to become the most expensive mistake in the history of Russian strategic aviation. At just after 1 in the afternoon, on June 1, 2025, something small and fast lifts off less than a mile from the flight line. It isn't launched from a plane. It isn't launched from outside the base. It rises from a truck that has been parked nearby for days, maybe longer, and nobody has thought to ask what's inside. By the time anyone does ask, it's already too late. To understand why Olenya was left exposed, you have to understand what it was built to do, and why distance was always considered the answer. Russia's long-range aviation force is the backbone of its ability to strike far beyond its own borders without ever crossing the front line. The Tu-95 Bear is a Cold War-era airframe, first flown in the 1950s, but it is still flying, and still lethal, because it doesn't need to get close to anything. It launches Kh-101 cruise missiles from 1,000 kilometers out, then turns around and goes home to reload. The Tu-22M3 Backfire does something similar at supersonic speed. Neither aircraft needs to survive contact with the enemy. They just need to stay far enough away that contact never happens. Olenya is about as far away as Russian geography allows. It sits in the Murmansk region, inside the Arctic Circle, 1,000 kilometers from Ukraine in a straight line, and effectively unreachable by anything Ukraine was known to possess. No missile in Kiev's inventory could hit it. No manned aircraft could survive the flight. For the planners in Moscow, far and safe were the same word. That assumption did more than sit in the background. It shaped decisions. Aircraft at Olenya were not dispersed into hardened aircraft shelters the way some Russian air defense doctrine calls for closer to the front. They sat in the open, in neat lines, because hardening a base against a threat you don't believe exists is a waste of resources. Distance was the shelter. Distance was the plan. Ukraine's security service, the SBU, had been quietly working against that exact assumption for roughly 18 months. The operation, codenamed Pavutina, or Spiderweb, was kept secret even from Ukraine's own allies. Not because Kyiv didn't trust them, because a plan this fragile only survives in total silence. One leak, one intercepted communication, and every truck, every drone, every driver becomes evidence in a case that ends before it begins. The idea itself was almost absurdly simple once you see it laid out. Don't fly a weapon toward Olenya, drive it there. Build wooden cabins with roofs that retract on command, load each one with small first-person view drones, mount the cabins on the backs of ordinary flatbed trucks, and hire Russian civilian drivers to haul them across the country as legitimate cargo. Prefabricated housing panels, nothing anyone would think twice about. Let Russia's own highway system do the work no missile could do. Let distance become irrelevant, because the weapon was never approaching from outside. It was already standing inside the gate. 5 trucks, 5 air bases. Belaya in Siberia, Diaghilevo in Ryazan, Ivanovo-Severny, Ukrainka in the Far East, near the Chinese border, and Olenya, above the Arctic Circle, home to some of Russia's oldest and most irreplaceable Tu-95 bombers. Here's the detail that should have mattered more than it did. Russia knew, in a general sense, that its parked aircraft were vulnerable to precision strikes. For more than a year, images had circulated of Russian bombers with old car tires painted or physically placed across their wings and fuselages. A low-tech countermeasure meant to confuse the seeker heads on incoming cruise missiles and complicate targeting from satellite imagery. The tire-camouflage was built to defeat something looking down from altitude, from distance, from outside the base perimeter. A missile using satellite-derived coordinates, or a strike planned days in advance from imagery review. It was never built to defeat something already parked less than a kilometer away, watching the runway in real time, close enough to see the airframe with its own onboard camera rather than guess at it from a grainy overhead photo. By the morning of June 1st, the trucks were in position. Some had been sitting for days. At Olenya, the truck carrying the drones destined for the base was parked on a road near the perimeter, blending into the ordinary flow of commercial traffic that Arctic logistics routes see every day. Nothing about it looked wrong. Nothing about it was designed to look wrong. The aircraft themselves sat exactly where they always sat. Rows of Tu-95s, some already fitted with the tire camouflage that was supposed to make them harder to identify from far away. It would do nothing for what was coming from close up. At the appointed hour, a signal goes out. Not over a military channel, not encrypted, but over Russia's own civilian cellular network. The same towers ordinary Russians use to call home. It reaches all 5 trucks within seconds of each other, across 3 time zones, from the Arctic to the Chinese border. The roofs lift, from inside wooden boxes, built to look like nothing more than transported housing panels. First-person view drones climb into open air, 117 of them across all 5 locations combined. At Olenya, this is the moment Russian air defense has nothing to say about. The base's protection was built around detecting threats from far away. Aircraft on radar, missiles crossing a border, anything with enough distance to be tracked and intercepted before arrival. None of that infrastructure has anything to offer against a swarm of small drones that never crossed a border at all, because they were already standing on Russian soil, parked in a truck a few hundred meters from the flight line. The drones close the distance in seconds, not minutes, seconds. There is no window for a scramble, no time for anti-aircraft systems built for high-altitude threats to reorient towards something skimming in low and slow, hugging the ground the way small drones do. The aircraft sitting in the open at Olenya, the same aircraft Russia had judged safe because nothing could reach them from Ukraine, are struck one after another. 4 of the 5 trucks fire cleanly, the 5th does not. Near the village of Serishevo, in the Amur region on the opposite side of the country, the truck assigned to Ukrainka airbase catches fire on the open highway before it ever completes its mission. It burns in full view of passing traffic. Witnesses, dashcams, a very public failure at the exact moment 4 other trucks, thousands of kilometers away, are executing without a hitch. This is the point where the entire operation could have collapsed. A burning truck on a public road is not subtle. If Russian authorities connect it quickly enough to what's simultaneously unfolding at Belaya, Dyagilevo, Ivanovo-Severny, and Olenya, there is at least a theoretical window to raise alarms at the remaining sites, to warn security personnel, to scramble a response, to do anything at all before the other roofs open. That window closes before it matters. By the time anyone in Moscow understands that Ukrainka's failure is one leg of something far larger, the drones at the other 4 bases are already airborne, already locked onto targets, already past the point where any warning could change the outcome. The one truck that failed becomes, in hindsight, the clearest evidence of how little margin the operation actually had, and how completely it succeeded anyway. At Olenya specifically, there is no complication at all. The truck fires exactly as planned. The drones reach the flight line. And for the aircraft sitting there, bombers that in some cases had already flown missions launching cruise missiles at Ukrainian cities, there is no equivalent story of a near miss or a last-second reprieve. Reversal 1. Surely air defense responds. It doesn't, and the reason matters more than the fact. Russia's air defense network at bases like Olenya was designed and postured against a specific category of threat: aircraft, cruise missiles, ballistic weapons, things that approach from a distance long enough to be detected, tracked, and engaged. A short-range drone launched from a truck parked inside the effective radius of the base isn't just hard to stop. It's a threat category the system was never oriented to look for in the first place. You cannot intercept what you never expected to originate from where it did. Reversal 2. Surely the camouflage helps. It doesn't, for the same underlying reason. The tires draped over Tu-95 wings were a countermeasure against threats reading the aircraft's shape and heat signature from altitude. A missile, a satellite pass, a strike planned from imagery taken hours or days earlier. An FPV drone approaching at low altitude, close enough to visually confirm its target through its own onboard camera, isn't fooled by a change in how the aircraft looks from above. It sees the plane the way a person walking up to it would see the plane. Camouflage engineered for one category of observer is simply irrelevant to another. Reversal 3. Surely the damage numbers are clear. They aren't. And this is where the story gets genuinely complicated rather than simply dramatic. In the days immediately after the strike, Ukraine's SBU put out a sweeping public claim. 41 aircraft hit across all 5 bases, roughly 34% of Russia's strategic cruise missile-carrying bomber fleet, total damage exceeding $7 billion. It was an extraordinary number, and it was Ukraine's own assessment, released for maximum strategic and psychological effect in the middle of an active war. Independent verification tells a narrower, though still remarkable story. Commercial satellite operators, Maxar Technologies, Planet Labs, Umbra Space, happened to be passing over these exact coordinates on their normal orbital schedules in the days that followed, and none of them answer to Moscow or Kyiv. Their imagery, cross-referenced by outlets including Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, The War Zone, and analysts at the Institute for the Study of War, allows for independent confirmation of destruction at 2 of the 5 sites specifically, Belaya and Olenya. At Olenya, the confirmed picture is this: at least 4 Tu-95 MS bombers destroyed, based on burn marks and wreckage visible in imagery dated June 2nd through June 4th, along with damage to an An-12 transport and possible damage to at least 1 additional aircraft on the runway. Combined with Belaya's confirmed losses, a mix of Tu-95s and Tu-22 M3 bombers, independent analysts land on a range of roughly 11 to 13 aircraft destroyed across those 2 bases alone, with several more likely damaged, but not conclusively destroyed based on available imagery. That gap, 41 claimed versus 11 to 13, independently confirmed at 2 of 5 locations, isn't necessarily a contradiction. Ukraine's number covers all 5 bases and includes aircraft hit, which is a broader category than destroyed. Independent satellite analysis by its nature can only confirm what's visible from orbit, at whatever resolution and lighting conditions happened to be available on the days imagery was captured, and Russia had every incentive, and took real steps, to obscure the true count in the days that followed. Because here's the part that complicates the story further. Russia didn't just accept the damage and count it publicly. Analysts comparing satellite images from June 2nd against images from June 4th noticed something specific. Aircraft that had been destroyed were, in at least one case, replaced with intact airframes or decoys positioned in the exact same spots on the tarmac. Other damage appeared to have been taped over or covered, an attempt to defeat the resolution limits of commercial satellite cameras rather than repair anything. It didn't fully work. The same OSINT analysts who caught the original damage caught the concealment attempt too, cross-referencing frame by frame, comparing shadows, comparing the exact positioning of wreckage against what had been there days before. But it complicates any clean final number. Some aircraft that were destroyed may be undercounted in later imagery, because Russia moved decoys into their place before the next satellite pass. Some aircraft counted as merely damaged may in fact have been effectively destroyed for operational purposes, unable to fly again even if their airframes remain physically present. What isn't in dispute, from any source, Ukrainian or independent, this was the most damaging single strike on Russian strategic aviation assets since at least the closing months of the Second World War. The Tu-95 hasn't been in production since the 1990s. Every one of them lost, whether the true number lands closer to Ukraine's 41 or the independently confirmed 11 to 13, represents an aircraft Russia cannot simply order off an assembly line to replace. The same is true, even more acutely, of the A-50 airborne early warning aircraft reportedly damaged in the operation, a genuinely irreplaceable asset given how few Russia has ever operated. At Olenya specifically, the wreckage sat visible on the tarmac for days before any serious concealment effort began, long enough for the first wave of satellite imagery to lock in an independently verifiable record that no amount of tarps or decoys could fully erase after the fact. The 5 civilian truck drivers who carried the weapon into position without knowing what they carried were not so fortunate. All 5 were detained by Russia's FSB. 1 was killed in an explosion related to the operation. The other 4 now face terrorism charges and the possibility of decades in prison. The SBU operatives who built the operation, who selected the targets, who spent 18 months turning ordinary Russian infrastructure into the delivery mechanism for 117 drones. They were already gone, out of Russian territory, before a single roof ever opened. Russia spent years defending its bombers against everything it could imagine arriving from far away, and it was right to worry about distance, because for most of the war, distance was the only real vulnerability its strategic aviation had. At Olenya, above the Arctic Circle, 1,000 kilometers from the nearest front line, that defense worked exactly as designed. It simply defended against the wrong direction. That's the verdict.